In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to the Missing Dots, where we confront the questions most people avoid, but every thinking Muslim eventually asks. Today, we step into one of the most sensitive debates in Islamic intellectual history, the legacy of Imam Abu Hanifa. Was he a unifier or the first divider? Did he create a sect or simply formalize a method of reasoning? Why did millions adopt his school so quickly, and what freedoms or restrictions did his approach introduce? Did the Hanafi tradition open doors for critical thinking or quietly close them? How many scientists, thinkers, reformers, or free-minded scholars emerged from this school compared to others? And in our modern world, where people are leaving and entering Islam for complex reasons, what role does this school of thought play? Tonight, we examine these questions with academic honesty, historical depth, and the courage to explore 100 taboo questions that many hesitate to ask. No praise, no attack, just truth, evidence, and clarity. Let's begin connecting the missing dots.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to getting into this.
Yeah, to really get to the bottom of this, you and I are going to be walking through an absolute mountain of source material today. I mean, we're looking at a comprehensive, PhD-level historical analysis of Islamic jurisprudence.
Right. It's a lot of material.
It is. And it's sitting right alongside a rigorous, unflinching breakdown of those 100 highly critical questions I just mentioned. And when I say critical, I want to be entirely transparent with you, the listener, about what we are actually looking at here.
Yeah, we need to be clear on the sources.
Exactly. These are taboo questions sourced directly from very pointed Salafi critiques, complex Shia perspectives, and even, rigorous arguments from ex-Muslims and atheists. We have everything here.
From classical texts by scholars like al-Sarakhsi and Ibn Taymiyyah.
All the way to modern demographic data from Pew Research. It's just a massive stack of information. And the goal here isn't to skim it. The goal is to actually understand the mechanics of what happened historically and intellectually.
Well, before we start turning the pages on these sources, we really need to establish some ground rules for how we are handling this material.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are going to be unpacking arguments from across the entire theological and ideological spectrum today. So when we bring up a severe critique from a specific sect, or a highly challenging question posed by an atheist or an ex-Muslim regarding the origins of Islamic law, we are not taking sides.
Right. We're just laying it out there.
Exactly. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we here to act as defenders or apologists for any particular school of thought. Our goal is purely analytical.
Yeah, we just want to look at what the critiques are, where they originate in the historical timeline, and how classical and modern scholarship has responded to them.
We are simply following the historical and theological data wherever it leads.
I think that's honestly the only way to do this fairly. So if you're listening to this and wondering where to even begin with a figure this monumental, let's start by confronting the biggest, most pervasive taboo question head on.
Let's do it.
It shows up repeatedly in our sources from multiple different and often opposing angles. Did Imam Abu Hanifa fracture a unified religion by creating a sect?
That is the core accusation, yeah.
Right. You look at the critiques, some traditionalists ask why he created a new, distinct group that split the ummah. On the flip side, you have atheists pointing to the existence of these different schools as proof that religion is just a man-made, fractured invention.
Yeah, they use it as evidence of inconsistency.
Exactly. Did he essentially invent sectarianism in Islam? Because looking at the sheer volume of his followers today, it certainly looks like a distinct faction.
Well, the historical texts demand that we clear up a massive linguistic and conceptual misconception before we can even address that. The sources are incredibly precise about the terminology here.
You mean the difference between the terms?
Yes, specifically the difference between a firqa and the madhab. And this isn't just semantics, this is the core of the entire debate. A firqa is a theological sect.
Okay, so how does that differ practically?
It involves a fundamental, distinct split in core dogma or political allegiance. The Kharijites were a fiqh. The early Shia movement, which was centered around political succession and theological authority, that was a firqa. Right. But a madhab, which is the proper classification for the Hanafi school, translates literally to a way or a methodological school of law. It is a framework for jurisprudence, not a new theology.
Okay, so the distinction is really between what you believe versus how you practice the legal details.
Precisely that. A Hanafi and a Shafi do not disagree on the oneness of God,
Mhm.
or the finality of prophethood, or the divine nature of the Quran. They share the exact same core theology, generally categorized as al-Sunnah.
So where is the friction then?
Their disagreements reside entirely in the realm of subsidiary, derivative legal questions. They're arguing over how to calculate specific agricultural taxes, or what precise actions invalidate physical ablution.
Or the specific postures required during formal prayer.
Exactly. They aren't debating the existence of the prayer. They are debating the methodology used to interpret the text regarding how the prayer is performed.
Honestly, it's actually pretty simple when you pull it out of the religious context. I was thinking about this while reading the historical breakdowns in the sources.
Oh, yeah. What's the comparison?
It's like looking at different medical schools. You can go to Johns Hopkins or the Mayo Clinic, right?
Right.
A surgeon trained in the Hanafi method and a surgeon trained in the Shafi method aren't disagreeing on the existence of the disease or the ultimate cure. They are both trying to save the patient.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, they're just debating the absolute best surgical technique to use based on the evidence they have and the way they were trained to read the medical literature.
The medical analogy holds up incredibly well, especially when you examine the timeline, which completely dismantles the first divider accusation.
The timeline is fascinating.
It really is. The political and theological splits within the Muslim community occurred long before Abu Hanifa even entered the picture. The Kharijites emerged around 657 CE during the First Fitna, which was the major civil war.
Wow, okay.
And the political and theological divergence regarding the Shia crystallized around the tragedy of Karbala in 680 CE. Imam Abu Hanifa wasn't even born until 699 CE.
Right. You can't be the architect of a fractured community if the major foundational splits happen decades before you drew your first breath.
Exactly. He was born into a world that was already deeply, profoundly fractured. Abu Hanifa was a tabi'i, meaning he belonged to the generation that immediately followed the companions of the Prophet.
So he was inheriting this post-war reality.
Yes. The community he inherited was already dealing with the aftermath of massive civil wars. He didn't introduce division. He introduced a formalized system of legal reasoning in an attempt to create order out of growing chaos.
Because before him, it was all very localized, right?
Highly regional. Prior to him, you had highly regional approaches to law. The people of Medina leaned heavily on the localized traditions of the people who lived there. The people of Iraq had a different flavor of practice based on the companions who had migrated there.
So Abu Hanifa is sitting there in Kufa, Iraq, and he's just looking at all of this.
Right, and he took the disparate Iraqi traditions and systematized them into a coherent legal philosophy.
Let's talk about Kufa for a second, because the sources dedicate a massive amount of ink to this specific city. It seems like you really can't understand Abu Hanifa without understanding Kufa.
No, you absolutely cannot.
Why was this specific location the catalyst for this massive shift in how Islamic law was formulated?
Well, Kufa in the 8th century was not the relatively homogeneous, traditional, tight-knit society of Medina in the Arabian Peninsula. If Medina was the spiritual heartland, Kufa was the frontier boomtown.
A boomtown.
Yeah, it was originally a military garrison city that had exploded into a massive cosmopolitan urban center. You had a heavy, pervasive Persian influence. You had a booming mercantile economy sitting on major trade routes.
So it's diverse, it's wealthy, it's moving fast.
Exactly. And crucially, you had a massive influx of new converts to Islam, coming from entirely different cultural, linguistic, and economic backgrounds.
So you have a religion that originated in 7th century Arabia suddenly expanding at lightning speed, and now it has to govern Persian merchants, farmers with ancient agricultural systems, and entirely different social hierarchies.
The early caliphates were encountering unprecedented, mind-boggling societal issues. They were dealing with complex trade partnerships that spanned continents, Byzantine and Persian agricultural land taxes.
Intricate banking systems?
Right, intricate banking systems, non-Arab social customs, and nuanced property disputes. The Quran and the Sunnah provide absolute divine foundational principles. They provide the moral compass.
But they don't give you the granular details.
No, they do not explicitly detail the intricate legal mechanics of a complex Persian forward-buying agricultural contract.
Because why would they? I mean, the Prophet's community in Medina wasn't engaging in massive multinational Persian agricultural speculation.
Exactly. So the local judges in Kufa were overwhelmed. They needed a consistent, logical framework to apply the divine principles of 7th century Arabia to the entirely novel, multicultural situations of 8th century Iraq.
Because if they didn't have a framework,
If those judges had just stubbornly relied on hyper-literal, surface-level readings of past texts, the legal system would have completely collapsed under the weight of this newly integrated society. The economy would have stalled, the courts would have frozen.
it strikes me that so many people today, maybe even you listening to this right now, feel completely overwhelmed by modern legal and ethical dilemmas.
Oh, absolutely.
We look at things like navigating AI ethics, or complex global finance, or bioethics, data privacy. We constantly feel this modern information overload and wonder how our historical faith traditions can possibly apply to these things without breaking.
And that's exactly what they were feeling back then.
Right. Reading these sources, I realized Abu Hanifa was essentially dealing with the 8th century version of that exact same information overload. He had an expanding global empire, dropping utterly novel, unprecedented problems on his desk every single day.
And that reality is the genesis of his entire methodology. He knew he couldn't just invent laws out of thin air, but he also knew that rigid literalism would destroy the society he lived in.
So you had to find a middle path.
Yes. This necessitates a specific, highly regulated blueprint for how to derive law when the text is silent. This is his usul, the foundational roots of his jurisprudence, which the classical sources argue is his supreme legacy.
I was staring at the classical defense of this methodology in the sources, and I have to admit I struggled with parts of it. Let's actually walk through the architecture of his reasoning.
Okay, let's break it down.
Because the moment you say we need a framework for when the text is silent, your critics are going to accuse you of inventing religion.
The sources outline his methodological hierarchy with intense clarity, and it was anything but a free-for-all. Number one, without exception, is the Quran. If a clear, explicit answer exists within the Quran, the debate immediately ceases.
Makes sense.
Number two is the authenticated Sunnah, the recorded actions and sayings of the Prophet. Number three is ijma, which is the established consensus of the early scholars and the companions.
Okay, so far so standard. Everyone agrees on those three, right?
Generally, yes. But the distinct character of the Hanafi school emerges in step 4. When those three primary sources were entirely silent on a specific, unprecedented issue, Abu Hanifa relied heavily on qiyas, which is analogical reasoning, and rai, which is deeply considered reasoned opinion.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of the critics we are examining. The Salafi critiques in the sources, the traditionalist Hanbali critiques, they hit this specific point incredibly hard. If you're heavily relying on Ravi, your own reasoned opinion, how is that not just a 7th century way of playing God with the texts?
That's the main charge, yes.
Right. How did he justify this to traditionalists who felt that if an issue is not explicitly mentioned in the literal text, human beings have no business legislating on it? Aren't you just substituting divine law with human logic?
It is the most fundamental critique of his entire legacy, and the Hanafi defense found in texts like al-Siraksi's is highly intricate. The defense argues that Abu Hanifa's use of Ravi was never arbitrary personal preference.
So he wasn't just making things up as he went along.
Not at all. He wasn't sitting in a courtyard in Kufa just dreaming up laws because they felt culturally appropriate.
Yeah.
He was building a tether. He would take a novel problem and use qiyas to trace it back to a divine principle.
How does that work in practice?
Qiyas means finding the underlying legal cause, the ila, in an existing Quranic ruling and mapping it onto the new situation.
Okay, so he's not inventing the rule. He's extracting the reason behind the rule.
Yes, the classic example.
Yeah.
The Quran forbids the consumption of wine.
Huh.
Why? The traditionalists might say because God said so, and we stop there. The Hanafi method says God forbade it because the underlying cause, the ila, is intoxication, which destroys the intellect.
Right, the intoxication is the actual problem.
Exactly. Therefore, if someone in Kufa invents a completely new synthetic drug that didn't exist in the Prophet's time, qiyas allows the judge to forbid it because it shares that identical underlying cause.
Ah, I see.
It is logic, yes, but it is logic firmly anchored to the bedrock of revelation. However, where Abu Hanifa truly set the intellectual world on fire was with a concept called istihsan.
Istihsan, juristic preference. This is the one that really caused a massive historical stir. The sources quote Imam Shafi'i famously declaring, "Whoever uses istihsan has legislated." That is a brutal accusation.
It really is.
He's basically saying the Hanafis are bypassing God and making up their own laws.
It was wildly controversial. To understand istihsan, you have to view it as an equity clause. It is a legal emergency brake.
An emergency brake.
Yes, it's a highly sophisticated mechanism that allows a judge to pivot away from strict, rigid, analogical reasoning cases. If applying that strict analogy would result in a ruling that is demonstrably unjust, highly impractical, or causes severe, undue public hardship.
So they prioritize the spirit over the letter.
The driving philosophy is that the ultimate goal of the Sharia is human welfare. Therefore, preserving the merciful spirit of the law always takes precedence over enforcing the rigid letter of the law when the two conflict.
I need a concrete example of this because in the abstract it does sound a bit like a loophole. How did this actually play out in an 8th century courtroom?
The sources repeatedly point to the Salam contract as the textbook application of istihsan. In strict Islamic commercial law, there is an ironclad general principle. You cannot sell something that you do not currently possess.
Which makes total sense.
The wisdom here is obvious. It prevents fraud, speculation, and uncertainty. If we apply strict qiyas, strict analogy, to agriculture, a farmer in Iraq cannot sell his wheat crop to a merchant before the wheat has actually grown, been harvested, and sits in his possession.
But wait. If I'm an 8th century farmer, I need capital in the spring to buy the seeds, repair the irrigation, and hire labor. I can't wait till the autumn harvest to get paid. If I can't pre-sell my crop, I can't farm.
And if you can't farm, the agricultural economy of Kufa collapses. If the agricultural economy collapses, the Abbasid Empire scarves. So the Hanafi jurists looked at that strict analogy, the rule against selling what you don't own, and realized it was practically a suicide pact for the farming sector.
It would mean everyone.
Strict analogy would cause massive, catastrophic public harm.
So they use istihsan to break the rule.
They use istihsan to pivot to a higher, broader rule. They argued that the overarching Quranic principle of facilitating human welfare and removing societal hardship actually overrides the narrower commercial rule against forward selling.
Oh, wow.
They legally permitted the Salam contract, the forward buying of crops, provided the terms, the weight, the type of wheat, and the delivery date were explicitly defined to mitigate the risk of fraud. They preferred equity over strict analogy to save the society from economic ruin.
Okay, I said the brilliance in that. It's not abandoning the law. It's recognizing that two legal principles are competing, the rule against speculation versus the rule of public welfare, and choosing the one that actually serves justice in that specific gritty context.
Precisely.
But this reliance on logic brings up question 3 from the taboo list in the sources. The critics, especially the traditionalists, ask why Abu Hanifa rejected so many authentic hadith. They argue that when his logic clashed with the saying of the Prophet, he threw out the Prophet's words.
This specific accusation is arguably the most intense historical friction point between the Hanafi school and the al-Hadith, the traditionalists. But the claim that Abu Hanifa simply rejected the Sunnah out of arrogance is a profound misunderstanding of the historical reality he was navigating. Remember the context we just established about Kufa. It wasn't just a bustling trade center. Iraq was a relentless hotbed of political rebellion. You had various Alid revolts, Kharjite uprisings, and Abbasid political maneuvering. And in the 8th century, the weapon of choice for a political faction was a fabricated hadith.
Wait, really? People were literally inventing quotes and attributing them to the Prophet to legitimize their political rebellions.
It was an epidemic.
Yeah.
Kufa was essentially a factory for forged hadith. So put yourself in Abu Hanifa's position. He is trying to build a stable, divine legal framework. He accepted mutawatir hadiths, those transmitted by massive, undeniable, interlocking chains of people without a second thought.
Because those are undeniably authentic.
Right. But the vast majority of hadith were ahad solitary narrations reported by only 1 or 2 people in a chain of transmission. When presented with an ahad hadith, Abu Hanifa applied a level of scholarly skepticism that was practically unparalleled.
What were his criteria? If someone walked into his circle and said, the Prophet said X, what did Abu Hanifa do?
He subjected it to a rigorous stress test. If a solitary narration contradicted a broad, universally established Quranic principle, he paused. If it contradicted established logical norms or human experience without a clearly discernible divine reason, he hesitated.
He didn't just take their word for it.
No, he demanded that the narrator not just be honest or pious, but deeply understand the complex legal implications of the words they were transmitting. If an obscure, solitary hadith surfaced in Kufa that suddenly overturned a fundamental property right guaranteed by the Quran, Abu Hanifa would refuse to base a sweeping legal ruling on it.
Because he figured the likelihood of one guy accurately remembering an obscure quote was lower than the likelihood of the established Quranic principle being wrong.
Exactly.
So it wasn't a disrespect for the Prophet, it was actually a hyper-protective defensive stance to ensure nobody was falsely attributing things to the Prophet that broke the coherence of the Quran.
Precisely. His classical defenders argue he was the ultimate guardian, protecting the integrity of the law from forgeries and political manipulation. His traditionalist critics argue he set the evidentiary bar so impossibly high that he inevitably discarded valid, authentic prophetic guidance, relying on his own fallible intellect instead.
It's just a different way of evaluating risk.
It is a genuine, profound methodological difference in how to weigh historical evidence and mitigate risk. It is not a difference in reverence for the Prophet.
But that exact reliance on equity over strict text creates a massive vulnerability because the moment you say we're pivoting away from the literal text to avoid hardship, your critics are going to accuse you of inventing loopholes.
And they did.
And that is exactly what happened with the concept of ruksha, which takes us into some of the most hotly debated rulings in Islamic history.
The concept of ruksha is central to understanding the Hanafi mindset. In Islamic jurisprudence, you have azima, which refers to the strict default ideal norms of the law. This is the law operating under perfect conditions.
Yeah.
And then you have ruksha, which translates to concessions, relaxations, or exemptions. These are granted specifically to alleviate severe hardship in imperfect conditions. And historically, the Hanafi school is either famous or infamous, depending entirely on who you are reading, for its incredibly extensive use of ruksha.
And the Hanafis root this philosophy directly in the text, right? The sources point to that famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari where the Prophet explicitly instructs his governors, make things easy and do not make them difficult.
Yes, that's a foundational text for them.
It seems the Hanafis didn't just view that as general pastoral advice, they took it as a core operating legal mandate. But when you look at the 100 taboo questions compiled in the sources, the real-world application of this easiness is where the theological fireworks start.
Oh, without a doubt.
The critics flat out accuse them of diluting the religion to appease the masses. Let's look at one of the most explosive examples, the ruling on women marrying without a guardian, a wali.
That ruling alone generated centuries of fierce debate. The vast majority of other classical schools insist, based on specific hadith, that an adult woman must have a male guardian, a father, a brother, an uncle, consent to, and finalize her marriage contract for it to be valid.
But the Hanafis disagreed.
The Hanafi school took a completely different approach by applying their trademark logical consistency across different areas of law. Abu Hanifa looked at the underlying principles of human agency and property rights.
Wait, how does property law connect to a marriage contract?
In Islamic law, an adult woman has absolute independent financial agency. She can buy land, sell goods, run a mercantile empire, and manage her own finances without any male permission whatsoever.
Right, that's a given.
Abu Hanifa looked at that guaranteed financial independence and applied qiyas. He reasoned that if an adult woman possesses the full intellectual and legal capacity to enter into massive, life-altering financial contracts independently, it is logically incoherent to claim she suddenly lacks the mental or legal capacity to negotiate the contract of her own marriage. Therefore, the Hanafi school ruled that an adult, sane woman does not legally require a wali to validly marry.
If you're listening to this, just think about the context. We are talking about the 8th century. That is a massively empowering ruling for women. But you can instantly see why it would be terrifying and highly controversial to more patriarchal or traditionalist mindsets of the era. They viewed it as overturning the social order.
It was incredibly disruptive to prevailing social norms. We see this same inclination towards practical leniency in the physical gestures of prayer.
Like the actual movements.
Yeah, while other schools developed highly specific, elaborate requirements for raising the hands at multiple points or mandated precise physical postures, the Hanafi approach is generally much more streamlined. They minimize extra movements.
Why is that? Just to be easier.
The underlying rationale was often to make the 5 daily prayers physically easier to maintain for the elderly, for the sick, or for the laborers working grueling physical jobs.
And they also heavily incorporated urf, local custom, into the law, right?
Yes. Urf is a massive pillar of Hanafi pragmatism. Remember, the empire is expanding rapidly into Central Asia and the Byzantine territories. If a newly conquered population in Bukhara had a specific centuries-old way of conducting trade, the Hanafi jurists didn't automatically outlaw it just because it wasn't practiced in 7th century Medina.
As long as it didn't violate the core rules.
Exactly. As long as the local custom didn't explicitly violate a clear Quranic ban, like the ban on riba, or interested jurists would generally bless it as valid urf, they integrated local culture rather than erasing it.
Okay, but let's touch on the truly taboo cases mentioned in the source critiques. The ones that critics point to and say, look, they didn't just adapt, they completely ignored the divine rules using legal tricks. What about the Nabid controversy? Because the sources mention an early Hanafi ruling that essentially allowed the consumption of certain types of alcohol.
The Nabid issue is a fascinating case study in how strict linguistics can lead to controversial outcomes. The Quran strictly forbids khamr. Historically and linguistically in early Arabic, khamr referred specifically and exclusively to fermented wine made from grapes or dates.
Okay.
In early Hanafi thought, some jurists applied an intensely literal, restrictive definition to that word. They argue that fermented drinks made from entirely different substances like wheat, barley, or honey, which were collectively known as nabid, were not technically classified as khamr in the Arabic dictionary.
Oh, wow. Wait, they argued that because it wasn't made of grapes, it wasn't legally wine.
Exactly. Based on that strict linguistic categorization, some early Hanafis argued that nabita was legally permissible to consume, provided it was consumed solely for physical strength or medicinal purposes, and absolutely not consumed to the point of intoxication.
I can hear the traditionalist critics screaming across the centuries about that one. That sounds exactly like a loophole.
It was heavily criticized,
Yeah.
and it's a prime example of why their methodology was viewed with suspicion by literalists. However, it's crucial to follow the historical timeline.
They didn't stick with that ruling.
No. Later Hanafi scholars, observing the actual societal impact, effectively closed this door. They issued sweeping fatwas prohibiting all nabid for public safety, recognizing that the intoxicating effect is the true, universal cause for prohibition, regardless of the base ingredient. But the early nabid rulings highlight their willingness to push legal boundaries based on hyper-strict categorization.
And what about the hudud punishments, the strict corporal punishments for theft or illegal intercourse that everyone associates with classical Islamic law? The sources indicate the Hanafis set an incredibly high, almost impossible bar for actually implementing these.
They did, and this is entirely based on the legal concept of shubha, which translates to doubt or ambiguity. There is a foundational legal maxim in Islam, derived from a prophetic tradition which states, ward off the hudud punishments if there's any doubt.
So they leaned into the doubt.
The Hanafi jurists maximized this concept of shubha to an extraordinary degree. They engineered such stringent, complex evidentiary requirements for crimes carrying corporal punishment that it became practically impossible for a court to actually carry them out.
Give me an idea of how stringent, how hard was it to convict someone?
Very hard. For example, in a case of theft, the stolen object had to meet a specific value. It had to be stolen from a highly secure location. The confession had to be repeated multiple times and could be retracted at the very last second, and any slight discrepancy in witness testimony threw the entire case out.
Wow, so almost any technicality could save the defendant.
Their underlying philosophy was profoundly merciful.
Yeah.
They believed it was better for a judge to make an error in leniency and let 100 guilty people walk free than to make an error in severity and mutilate or execute one innocent person unjustly.
I never thought about it that way. You look at it from one angle, and it seems like they're dismantling the law. But look at it from the other. It's like the difference between a small business owner using a complex legal tax deduction to save their family farm from foreclosure versus a massive billionaire exploiting an offshore loophole just to hoard wealth. The Hanafis, looking at these rulings, seemed like they were trying to use the intricate machinery of the law to save the farm.
That's a very empathetic way to frame it.
They were using complexity to protect the vulnerable from the harsh, unyielding application of state power.
That is a very historically grounded reading, and it aligns perfectly with how classical Hanafi defenders view these complex rulings. They don't call them loopholes, they call them makarij, which literally means exits or legitimate ways out of extreme, crushing hardship.
But obviously the critics don't see it that way.
No, to maintain our analytical impartiality, we must relay how the critics in the sources view this. The documents show that modern ex-Muslims and secular critics often point to these exact same rulings, these hayal or legal devices, as ultimate proof that Islamic law is just man-made pragmatism.
Because they're finding ways around the clear rules.
Their argument is straightforward. If human beings can invent a clever legal trick to get around a supposedly divine command, it proves the command isn't really divine at all, but just a human construct meant to be manipulated.
And how does the traditionalist Salafi critique frame these same loopholes?
The Salafi critique approaches it from the exact opposite theological flank.
Hmm.
They don't see man-made invention. They see a dangerous dilution of tawhid, a compromise of God's ultimate sovereignty.
So to them, it's about submission.
Exactly. For a strict traditionalist, God's law is absolute, testing, and sometimes inherently difficult. Inventing human logic puzzles to bypass the difficult parts of revelation is viewed as a form of spiritual corruption. Ibn Taymiyyah, the great Hanbali scholar, wrote extensively and aggressively against Hanafi Hayal, arguing that these legal tricks destroy the moral purpose and the spiritual discipline of the Sharia.
It's wild how the exact same thing can be interpreted so differently.
So you have this fascinating multi-layered historical dynamic where the exact same flexibility is viewed as merciful brilliance by its defenders, definitive proof of man-made invention by secular atheists, and dangerous theological heresy by strict traditionalists.
Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot point in the historical narrative. Because if this massive legal school prioritized logic, equity, and intellectual flexibility to this intense degree, how did that specific intellectual culture impact the broader world outside of the courtroom?
Oh, the impact was monumental.
We need to look at the era of the mind on fire, the intersection of this law with science, philosophy, and the Islamic Golden Age. Because this is a major recurring theme in the 100 questions from the sources. Did the Hanafi methodology produce bold freethinkers, or did it ultimately stifle human progress?
Well, if we isolate the historical data from the Abbasid period, the evidence strongly suggests that the Hanafi school of reason provided the essential socio-legal stability and the exact intellectual climate that allowed the Islamic Golden Age to flourish.
Wait, really? The legal school is responsible for the scientific boom?
You fundamentally cannot separate the monumental scientific achievements of the Abbasid era in Baghdad from the fact that the Abbasid state bureaucracy operated almost entirely on Hanafi law.
Because the environment itself rewarded rational inquiry. Like, if the judges are using logic, the scientists feel safe using logic.
Exactly that. The legal methodology trained generations of minds to constantly look for underlying causes, to utilize complex analogies, and to relentlessly debate hypothetical scenarios. This legal rationalism didn't stay confined to the courts. It bled heavily into theology and natural philosophy.
And that leads to groups like the Mu'tazila.
We see this early connection with the Mu'tazila, a highly rationalist, philosophical, theological movement that shared a massive amount of intellectual DNA and personnel with early Hanafism. But more permanently, we see it in maturity theology.
Maturity theology. The sources mention this as the standard theological engine for the Hanafi world. What is their core premise?
The maturity school makes a radical, deeply empowering claim about human nature. They famously argue that human reason, aql, is an independent, valid source of moral knowledge.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
They argue that even without any divine revelation, even if a person lived on a deserted island and never saw a Quran or met a prophet, that human beings should still be able to rationally deduce the existence of a creator and figure out basic, fundamental moral truths, like the inherent evil of murder or the inherent goodness of justice, purely through the use of their own intellect.
That is a profound elevation of the human mind. They are essentially saying reason isn't the enemy of faith, reason is the prerequisite for faith.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
So when the source documents list the famous scientific minds of the era and address the modern question of where are the Nobel Prizes, what do we actually find?
Well, the sources are intellectually honest enough to point out that Hanafi science isn't a real, tangible category. I mean, gravity works the exact same way, whether the scientist calculating it is a Hanafi, a Shafi'i, or an atheist.
Science.
However, the sociological correlation is undeniable. The towering giants of the Islamic Golden Age, figures like Al-Khwarizmi, who essentially gave the world algebra and the concept of algorithms.
Huge names.
Al-Biruni, who made staggering advancements in astronomy, physics, and anthropology. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose medical texts were used in Europe for centuries. These monumental intellects largely operated in environments dominated by Hanafi law and culture, specifically in places like Baghdad, Central Asia, and Persia.
So the culture supported them.
The underlying intellectual climate supported, funded, and protected their empirical work. And bringing the data up to the modern era, the sources specifically mention Aziz Sankar, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2015 for his groundbreaking work on DNA repair. He comes from Turkey, a region deeply steeped in centuries of Hanafi intellectual tradition.
Oh, wait. If you're listening to this, you might be thinking the same thing I am.
I have to push back here because the sources are absolutely full of critiques from modern atheists, secular reformers, and ex-Muslims asking a very pointed, painful question.
And it's a valid historical question. If the founder of this school was this radical freethinker who encouraged debate, and if the Golden Age was so incredibly vibrant and scientifically advanced, why do critics look at the modern Hanafi world today and claim it is stuck in the past? What happened to all that intellectual fire? What happened to the so-called gates of Ijtihad?
You have just hit upon the central paradox of the Hanafi tradition and arguably one of the greatest tragedies of Islamic intellectual history.
So what happened?
The historical reality is that Imam Abu Hanifa absolutely aggressively opened the doors of Ijtihad, which is the process of independent, critical, legal reasoning. He debated constantly. He encouraged dissent.
He actually liked when people disagreed with him.
Yes, his own two most famous students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shabani, famously disagreed with their own teacher on hundreds of major rulings, and their dissenting opinions are recorded and respected in the school's texts. It was originally a vibrant, living, breathing intellectual ecosystem.
So what broke? How do you go from a system that celebrates students disagreeing with their master to a system that critics say demands blind obedience?
It wasn't a theological failure. It was a consequence of massive success and empire.
Empire.
Over the centuries, as the Hanafi school was adopted and became the official state law of massive, sprawling, complex bureaucracies like the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire in India, the priorities of the state shifted. An empire needs uniformity.
Yeah.
You simply cannot run a massive transcontinental imperial court system stretching from the Balkans to Yemen if every single local judge is doing their own independent ijtihad and arriving at different conclusions.
Oh, that makes total sense. It creates legal chaos.
Exactly. The state needed a standardized manual.
Right. If I'm a merchant traveling from Istanbul to Cairo, I need to know the contract law is the same in both places.
Precisely. So, to achieve this necessary standardization, the later scholars institutionalized a concept called taqlid, which means following established precedent or imitating the rulings of the past masters.
Basically saying, look, Abu Hanifa and the early guys already figured this out. They were smarter than us. Just follow the manual.
That became the prevailing mindset. They argued that the early masters had already done the heavy intellectual lifting, and for the sake of societal stability and legal predictability, later generations of judges and laypeople should practice taqlid.
But didn't that just kill the innovation?
It did. What started as a highly practical administrative tool for the Ottoman courts eventually hardened into an intellectual straitjacket. The school of reason eventually became, in many regions, deeply conservative. Scholars began relying exclusively on commenting on centuries-old texts, rather than applying Abu Hanifa's original dynamic rational methodology to the new problems of their own eras.
That's heartbreaking, honestly.
The tragic reality is that the doors of ijtihad didn't lock from the outside. They rusted shut from the inside due to institutional inertia and the crushing weight of empire.
Wow. The paradox of taqlid. That is a heavy, almost melancholic realization. A system built on adaptation became paralyzed by its own success.
It's a very common historical cycle.
And that shift towards conservatism brings us directly to the present day, to the reality of modern empires, cultural attrition, and conversions. Because today, the people listening to this aren't living in the 16th century Ottoman Empire. They are navigating modern secularism, the internet, globalized finance, and social media. And according to the source data, some are leaving the faith entirely.
Let's ground this in the demographic reality first, just to understand the sheer scale of what we're discussing today.
Yeah, how many people we're talking about?
The demographic sources, including extensive Pew Research data, confirm that approximately 45 to 50% of all Muslims globally follow the Hanafi school. That equates to roughly 800 million human beings.
Half the Muslim world.
Yes, it is overwhelmingly the dominant tradition in Turkey, the Balkans, the post-Soviet Central Asian republics, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh.
So when we look at the taboo questions regarding apostasy, people actually leaving Islam, do the demographic sources show that they are leaving because the Hanafi school is too lax and doesn't offer enough spiritual rigor? Or conversely, are they leaving because it's too rigidly stuck in taqlid and can't answer modern questions?
The sociological data here is fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive. The sources show no disproportionate apostasy rates that are specific to the Hanafi madhab compared to other schools.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When people leave Islam in these regions, they generally cite broader philosophical doubts, the problem of evil, or clashes with modern scientific materialism. They are not leaving because they are frustrated with the intricacies of 8th century forward-buying agricultural contracts.
That makes sense. People leave for bigger reasons.
However, what the data does show is that Hanafi regions often display a remarkable, almost stubborn resilience in retaining a core Muslim identity, even when subjected to highly aggressive secularized states.
Really, why is that? What is insulating them?
Look at the historical examples of modern Turkey under early Kemalist reforms, or the post-Soviet republics in Central Asia like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. These populations survived decades of intense state-enforced secularism, and in the case of the Soviets, militant state atheism.
They held on through all of that.
The academic sources suggest that a key reason for the survival of the faith in these specific regions is a fundamental, deeply ingrained Hanafi legal distinction between two spheres of life, idatif and mu'amalat.
Okay, break those terms down for me. How does this distinction save a religion under state atheism?
Ibadat refers to the acts of worship, the private spiritual relationship between a person and God. Prayer, fasting, belief in the unseen. Muamalat refers to civil transactions, criminal law, and societal interactions.
Okay, so the private versus the public.
Because the Hanafi school historically allowed for immense flexibility in local custom urf and always gave the state massive leeway in administering civil matters, a Hanafi Muslim possesses a unique psychological framework. They can conceptually accept living under a completely secular civil code for their banking, their traffic laws, and their public administration, while fiercely, privately maintaining their ibad, their prayers and core theology in their homes.
SubhanAllah, I'm just putting the pieces together here. So they don't feel that participating in a modern secular economy automatically makes them a heretic or a bad Muslim because their specific legal tradition has always been inherently pragmatic and adaptable regarding civil transactions.
Exactly. The Hanafi framework doesn't demand a theocratic state to validate the individual's faith.
That is a massive paradigm shift. The very flexibility that angers the strict traditionalist critics we discussed earlier, the use of reason, the adaptation to local customs, the willingness to separate private worship from public civil law, is exactly what allows the religion to adapt and function in a 21st century pluralistic society without shattering.
It's incredibly resilient.
It essentially creates a built-in historical framework for a secular-friendly practice of Islam that still manages to retain the core, unyielding theology of the faith.
And that is precisely the argument that many modern reformist scholars are making today in the sources.
Yeah.
They argue that the Hanafi framework, if it can be stripped of the historical rigidity of Taqlid and returned to its original methodology, is perfectly equipped to handle the most terrifying modern questions.
Like AI and all that.
Exactly. It has the intellectual tools to handle AI ethics, modern biomedical cloning dilemmas, and the realities of democratic citizenship as a minority, precisely because it relies on finding the underlying cause, promoting public welfare, and utilizing reason, rather than demanding purely literalist readings of ancient texts for novel problems. It's an evolutionary legal system by design.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible, exhausting analysis of these sources and brings us to the final, profound irony of the man who started it all. When we peel back the layers of empire and separate Imam Abu Hanifa's original radical spirit from the massive conservative institution that currently bears his name, we see a totally different picture of the man.
We truly do. Imam Abu Hanifa, the man himself, was not a detached academic in an ivory tower. He was a highly successful, wealthy silk merchant in Kufa.
He had a day job.
He was entirely financially independent, which meant he didn't need the government's money. When the immensely powerful Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur demanded that Abu Hanifa serve as the chief judge of the empire, a position that came with unimaginable wealth, prestige, and power, Abu Hanifa flatly refused.
Why did he refuse?
He knew the imperial court was corrupt, he knew the caliph was unjust, and he categorically refused to lend his pristine intellectual reputation to legitimize a tyrannical ruler.
And he paid the ultimate price for that independence.
He was imprisoned by the caliph, he was publicly flogged, and the most reliable historical accounts strongly suggest he eventually died in that Abbasid prison, refusing to the very end to compromise his principles for state power.
It is the ultimate historical irony. The man who vehemently defied the state, who refused to be co-opted by the empire, who was beaten and imprisoned for his fierce independence. Well, his personal methodology was eventually adopted, standardized, and utilized to become the official, unyielding state law of the greatest Islamic empires in human history.
It is a profound testament to the undeniable power and brilliance of his ideas, even if the later empires sometimes utilized those ideas in bureaucratic ways he might not have ever recognized or approved of.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder as we wrap this up. We've seen how a brilliant system built entirely on reason, equity, and adaptation eventually became frozen in imitation and bureaucracy. But what if the fix for the modern era is already built into the very foundation of the system? Perhaps the most authentic way to follow Imam Abu Hanifa today isn't to rigidly mimic his specific 8th century rulings on agriculture, trade, or marriage. Perhaps the truest, most respectful way to honor his legacy is to reclaim his fearless, rational method, to have the courage to apply human reason to divine revelation, to relentlessly use the law to protect the vulnerable from harshness, and to boldly adapt the eternal principles of the faith to the unprecedented, chaotic context of our own modern time. May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.